welcome back. If you've just joined us, you're watching Good Morning Namibia. We do apologize that we won a what it means to Namibia. We're now joined by Ms. Eloise du Plessis, analyst and equity strategist at PSG in Namibia. Ms. du Plessis, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning.
Perhaps our starting point can be just for you to explain us who exactly the Fitch agency is and what authority they carry in grading of the economies worldwide.
Okay, Fitch is one of the three major rating agencies that is used throughout the world. We have Fitch, we have Standard & Poor's, and we have Moody's. And these three agencies are generally looked to by investors to give them an idea of whether it's a good idea to invest in certain countries or companies. For example, Nam Power and Nam Water also have Fitch ratings. So they do ratings of companies, they do ratings of countries, so that investors can understand, if I invest in this company, if I invest in this entity, is my money going to be safe?
Mm-hmm. What is a credit rating where a country is concerned? What does that mean?
Okay, a country has a certain budget. Like we hear every year when we do the budget review. Mm-hmm. It has certain amount of money coming in, and it has then certain expenses and investments that it wants to make. Mm-hmm. Just like a person, you also have your salary coming in, and then you have certain things that you want to do with that money. So you set up a budget for yourself and decide, okay, how am I going to allocate this income that comes in? A country does exactly the same. And then when you have a situation where your expenses or the investments you want to make, when the money that goes out is more than that coming in, you need to borrow money.
Right.
So whether you borrow that from a bank or from your grandmother, you need to borrow that money. And that's exactly the same with a country. And the way that a country borrows money is by what we call issuing bonds. So when we talk about Namibian government bonds, that is simply the government borrowing money. And they can borrow money from our local people, you, me, a pension fund in Namibia can buy a government bond where we give the government money and they pay us interest on that. But international investors can also buy these bonds. So what the international investor and the local investors need to know, if I lend this money to the Namibian government, are they going to be able to repay me? And that is what that credit rating says. So that the ratings go from A down to D. The different agencies have different ways that they say this. And where Namibia is currently, we're at a triple B minus, that means we're still investment grade. And what is important about that to understand is that international pension funds typically are only allowed to invest in investment grade bonds. So a pension fund, for example, in Norway or Sweden or in the USA can buy Namibian bonds. So they can lend money to the Namibian government if we are investment grade. Mm-hmm. And at this stage, that is still where we are. So I hope that explains.
It does give a bit of clarity, yes. Now, Namibia has been graded from stable to negative, and in the intro I also mentioned that it had been downgraded. What does this mean?
Okay, I think it's also important to understand that we haven't been downgraded. The only thing that's changed is the outlook. Now, what does that mean? When the outlook is changed, it means that the rating agency expects that things might go worse. So our rating hasn't changed at all. We haven't been downgraded at all. But what happened now is where previously it was stable, so it was likely that we're going to keep our investment grade rating. Now the likelihood is more to the side that we're going to be downgraded. So we haven't been downgraded yet, but because the outlook has changed, there's a likelihood that we could be.
All right. Now, when did this overshooting deficit take place? Because still in March this year, the same organization, which is the Fitch agency, had affirmed that Namibia's long-term and local currency issuer default ratings, the IDR, they were stable. So when did this happen?
I think that it's important to understand in March this year, we had forecasts of what the GDP growth was going to be for 2005. Okay, we didn't have final numbers yet. And the budget that was set up was also done on certain forecasts. What has happened since is that the numbers came out about what the GDP growth actually was in 2015, and that was lower than what was expected by the Namibian Statistics Agency. So what happened now, two things happened. Not only is the GDP growth lower, So that means that now our debt, what we owe to the rest of the world, is now larger as a part of this GDP. When we set up our budget, that budget was based on these higher growth figures. So when we decided in the budget, when our Ministry of Finance decided how much money Namibia is going to borrow, they were working on a larger GDP figure. So now we've committed to this debt, we've taken on this debt, we've got these expenses to pay, so we've issued these bonds, and this debt is now sitting there, but the GDP figure is lower. What also happened is that company and tax revenues, actually, income tax revenues actually came in less than expected. So just like when you have a certain expectation of what your income is going to be, now the income for the government was less, but there's still this debt sitting there. So that's the big thing that happened, that the forecasts used for GDP were a bit on the high side. So we took on more debt than this GDP debt to GDP ratio could actually handle to remain at an investment grade rating.
Besides those two issues that you mentioned just now, what were the other contributing factors to this, or were those the only ones?
I think those were the two most important ones. I think that our economy has struggled not only because of Namibian factors, but because of global factors. Okay, so the global economy is in a slump. We've seen where oil prices are. Oil prices have come down significantly, which put a lot of pressure on the Angolan retail market. Right. And so all those Angolan tourists who came to support the Namibian economy, they don't have all that money anymore because of the oil revenues going down in Angola, and that was also a big prop for our economy. And I think if you generally talk to people, they will tell you, my business is struggling. That's generally where we are at this stage. The drought, of course, hasn't helped. Maybe in March, when this rating was first done, there was still a hope and a prayer that we might get rain, which also hasn't happened. So there's just been this, I hate to say perfect storm because it's such a cliche, but it's really what's happened.
There's also been an underperformance in exports that led to the widening of the current account deficit. What could be the reason for the underperformance where exports are concerned?
That's mostly because of the global economy. What we've seen is that the Chinese economy has moved more to their own consumer market, and they stopped pushing this huge manufacturing drive outwards. So they've needed less of the natural resources that Namibia exports. We've seen a decrease in the demand for diamonds because the economies in Europe are struggling. So all of the global factors impact our exports. And that has definitely contributed to this as well.
Now, obviously now, since the Fitch agency has given us this rating, it's obviously important to get it back into a positive frame. Where do we start in reducing this 8.3% back to what would be considered normal?
I think that the Bank of Namibia has done a lot in the sense of the rising of the interest rates, the changing of the Credit Act to stem a lot of the imports that we get in, and that's been flowing in. We have seen that growth come down quite a bit, but at this stage we're sitting with this problem where we've got this huge debt load. So unless there's a major cutting of expenses, a complete change in how the economy is managed, it's going to be quite difficult to manage that down. So I think what was important is to realize that we need to have our forecasts right when we do these budgets at the beginning of the year.
Mr. du Plessis, any words in closing?
No, I think thank you so much for having me, and I hope that Namibia retains its investment grade rating because it's important for foreign investment. Right. If we slip below that, it's not a crisis. We've enjoyed a very great rating for a number of years. Right. But if we can retain that, it will be great to keep the foreign investment in our country.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning, speaking to us.
Thank you.
That was Eloise du Plessis, analyst and equity strategist at PSG, talking to us this morning. We'll be back shortly after this. Stay tuned.